The wind howled across the prairie, sweeping grit and rain into the night. A gray wall of clouds rolled over the horizon, turning the world into a blur of motion and thunder. Ethan Cole urged his mare faster, her hooves pounding the wet earth as the first drops of rain began to fall. He knew storms out here could turn fierce within minutes, and there was no sense tempting fate on open ground. He just needed to reach the barn before the worst of it broke loose. Then, through the curtain of rain, he saw movement near the fence line. A flicker of white, like fabric snapping in the wind, and then the shape of a woman stumbling along the muddy path. She clutched her shawl around her shoulders, her steps uneven, her head low against the driving rain. Without a thought, Ethan pulled the reins and rode straight toward her. The mare snorted, uneasy, but he pushed her on until he reached the stranger. She tried to speak, but her voice was lost in the roar of the storm. Her knees gave way before she could manage another word. Ethan was off his horse in an instant, his arms catching her just as she collapsed. She was trembling from head to toe, soaked clear through, her hair plastered against her face. He could feel the cold of her skin, even through her wet clothes. Without hesitation, he lifted her into his arms, holding her close as he swung back onto the saddle. The rain grew heavier, stinging his face and soaking them both, but he leaned low over the horse's neck, urging her forward. The trail to the ranch was little more than mud and shadows now, but Ethan knew every rise and dip by heart. The wind tore at them, lightning splitting the sky above as he pushed through the storm. Every heartbeat felt like a struggle against the night itself, but he kept going, his arms tightening around the fragile weight in his grasp. By the time he reached the ranch house, the wind was a living thing, slamming the shutters and rattling the roof. He jumped down, kicked open the door, and carried her inside. The warmth of the room hit them both, the low glow of the fire flickering across the wooden walls. He lowered her gently onto the rug in front of the hearth and shut the door behind him, shutting out the roar of the storm. For a moment, he just stood there, catching his breath, watching her. Her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. He knelt beside her, brushing wet hair from her face, and felt her shiver under his touch. She looked up at him, eyes wide and dazed, like she wasn't sure if he was real or a dream pulled from the darkness. He pulled a wool blanket from the chair nearby and wrapped it around her shoulders. She tried to speak again, her lips pale, but he lifted a hand to stop her. She needed warmth more than words. He moved to the hearth, stoking the fire higher, feeding it until the flames flared bright. The orange light spread across the room, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. When he turned back, she was still watching him, eyes following every move. He fetched a towel, dried her hair as best he could, and set a pot of water on the stove. The air was thick with the smell of rain and smoke, a mix that always made him think of the land, wild, untamed, and alive. She didn't look like someone meant for this rough country, but something in her eyes said she had the same fight, the same stubborn spark that refused to give in. When he offered her a cup of hot water, her hands brushed against his. The contact was brief, but it lingered. Her fingers were cold, small against his calloused ones, and yet there was a kind of strength there, a pulse that matched his own heartbeat. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with something unspoken. The rain outside hammered against the windows, but inside the cabin it was only the crackle of fire and the sound of two people breathing. He could have stepped back, could have found something else to do, but he didn't. He stayed kneeling beside her, the firelight casting warm gold across her face. Her eyes met his again, and this time there was no mistaking what passed between them. Not a word was said, but the air carried it just the same, gratitude, relief, and something deeper that neither of them had expected when the night began. The storm raged on outside, but in that small cabin, the world had gone still. Two strangers sat close by the fire, the distance between them shrinking with every flicker of flame. Ethan didn't understand it, not fully, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of loneliness pressing against him. Instead, he felt the quiet pull of something new, something fierce, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't turn away. Morning light crept gently into the cabin, soft and gold after the long night. The storm had passed, leaving the prairie washed clean and shining. The smell of wet earth drifted through the open window, mixing with the faint scent of wood smoke from the dying fire. Ethan sat at the small table with a cup of coffee in his hand, his eyes tracing the quiet world outside. The land was still. Even the horses stood silent near the fence, steam rising from their backs in the cool dawn. He turned his gaze toward the woman sleeping on the couch, still wrapped in the blanket he had given her. Her breathing was slow, and even now, no trace of the fear or exhaustion that had marked her face the night before. He didn't know her name yet, didn't know what road had brought her here or what she was running from, but something about her presence filled the house with a strange, steady calm. It had been years since Ethan had heard another voice under his roof. Years since laughter, or even soft words, had touched these walls. Yet now, it didn't feel like emptiness anymore. She stirred at last, her fingers curling in the blanket as she blinked into the morning light. For a moment, confusion crossed her face, and then her eyes found him. He gave a small nod, unsure of what to say. The silence stretched warm and unhurried. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her hair fell loose, catching the sunlight, and the faintest smile touched her lips when she realized he had stayed nearby all night. Ethan poured another cup of coffee and handed it to her. She accepted it carefully, her fingers brushing his once again. Neither spoke for a while. The only sound was the faint creak of the floorboards and the call of a hawk somewhere beyond the ridge. It wasn't the silence of strangers. It was easier, quieter, something that didn't need to be filled with talk. After a long moment, she looked toward the window, her eyes following the rolling hills beyond. The world outside gleamed fresh and alive. She said something about the beauty of it, her voice soft but steady. Ethan followed her gaze, seeing the land as if for the first time again. He had worked it, fought it, and nearly lost himself to it. But seeing it through her eyes made it feel different, like a place full of promise rather than burden. He told her she was welcome to stay as long as she needed, that the ranch had room and he wasn't expecting company. She looked back at him, that quiet smile returning, though there was a question in her eyes. She asked him why he was alone out here, what had kept him on the land when most men would have sold and gone to the towns. He didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to explain that the land was the only thing he trusted anymore, that people had a way of leaving when the world got hard. But as he looked at her, wrapped in his old blanket and framed by the glow of morning, he felt that answer shift inside him. Maybe he had stayed because somewhere deep down he'd been waiting for something, or someone, to remind him what it felt like to belong. He told her simply that the land needed him, and she nodded as if she understood more than the words he said. She stood then, walking slowly to the window. The light washed over her and the room seemed to grow brighter. When she turned back to him, her expression was open, unguarded, like someone who had made a decision she was no longer afraid of. She said she didn't want to keep running, didn't want to go back to where she came from. The past could stay where it was. She wanted to begin again, right here, where the air was clean and the sky went on forever. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, that old ache of loneliness mixing with a quiet, unexpected hope. He rose from his chair and stood beside her. They looked out together, the silence between them no longer empty but full of everything neither of them needed to say. The prairie stretched wide and endless before them, golden under the new sun. He reached out, his hand finding hers without thought. Her fingers slipped into his easily as if they had been waiting for that touch. The world beyond the window seemed to fade, leaving only the warmth of the moment. She looked up at him, her eyes steady, and he saw not a stranger rescued from the storm, but a life crossing into his own. The quiet inside the cabin felt sacred, like a promise neither of them dared to break.